Hello, welcome back to part 3 of our look at the endocrine system. And in this last and final segment, we will be focusing our attentions on looking at the adrenal gland and then just a little bit of a review of the pancreas. Much like the pituitary gland, the adrenal gland is also made up of two separate glands that during fetal development merge into one. So the adrenal cortex, the outer edge of the adrenal gland, is one separate endocrine gland. So all of this area all out here, and then the adrenal medulla right here, the adrenal medulla is actually a separate gland. And again, these two glands, these two individual glands during fetal development merge together into forming what is referred to as the adrenal gland. Again, when you look at the histology for these areas, the adrenal cortex looks more synonymous with renal tissue. Right, that we find within the kidney, and that's because the adrenal cortex is actually a structure that was during fetal development associated with the kidney, and the adrenal medulla is tissue that's actually associated with, once again, that neuroendocrine type of tissue, and so it has more neural appearance to it, just like the posterior pituitary did. And so we see very different histological profiles when we look at these two regions of this gland that now in the adult, in the post-fetal development stages of life, have now merged into this one individual gland. And so let's start our look with the adrenal medulla and what it looks like. The gland acts as a sympathetic ganglion, again, that neuroendocrine type of gland. It is stimulated through the sympathetic nervous system, and so it's got neural fibers that innervate directly into the adrenal medulla, and the neuroendocrine cells are actually anaxonic axons, and so that means that they really have only dendrites and no axons because they're not stimulating anything else. That neural impulse is being received by that neuroendocrine cell, and it immediately is releasing catecholamines into the bloodstream. And what is a catecholamine, that you may ask? Well, catecholamines are actually made up of three separate hormones. They are made up of epinephrine, norepinephrine, and dopamine. And so in this case here, they're actually acting as hormones and not neurotransmitters, even though both of these are synonymous with being neurotransmitters as well. Epinephrine is composing about 75% of the secretion, and norepinephrine is making up the other approximately 24 to 25% of the catecholamine, and dopamine is making up less than 1% of the overall secretion coming out of the adrenal medulla. And all of these are really working to regulate, if you would, metabolism. Right? So epinephrine is working to inhibit the release of insulin, and so that's actually going to slow down the rate of cell respiration. And part of that is because we want to conserve as much of the glucose as we can for brain function and not have it be absorbed in for muscular function. And so that then enforces the muscles to rely on fatty acids and or proteins as a energy reserve. About 80% of all of the glucose is actually kind of redirected and reserved for brain metabolism. And of course, we know that epinephrine, norepinephrine, is also going to be synonymous with sympathetic autonomic function. And so it kind of makes sense that these hormones would then go ahead and inhibit digestion and urine production while going ahead and increasing sympathetic activities, such as raising the heart rate and blood pressure. Remember that the main cell type that we're dealing here, those anaxonic cell types, are called chromaffin cells. And this here is just kind of a overview of the process by which we make dopamine. And so epinephrine, norepinephrine, and dopamine are actually derivatives of the amino acid phenylalanine. And so what ends up happening is within the adrenal medulla, phenylalanine is converted into tyrosine. Of course, these are enzymes that are doing this. And then tyrosine is first transformed, if you would, or has a derivation of dopamine. Dopamine can then be converted into norepinephrine. Norepinephrine can then be transformed into epinephrine. And so since epinephrine is at the end of this, we're producing more of this. And then once we hit the magic threshold of epinephrine, then we start to produce norepinephrine. And once we hit that magical threshold of norepinephrine, then we stop the metabolic pathway, the enzymatic pathway, and we then start producing dopamine. And then once we've hit that threshold of dopamine, we basically inhibit the phenylalanine from going ahead and being converted into tyrosine. Once we start to diminish our epinephrine levels, then phenylalanine is unblocked, if you would, and this metabolic pathway begins to pick back up again with this conversion of dopamine to norepinephrine to epinephrine. Of course, the zones of the adrenal cortex you do need to be aware of. Right? And so there are really three major groups or classifications of hormones that are secreted within the adrenal cortex. And what class of hormone is secreted is determined by the zone in which it is found. And so you have the zona glomerulosa, the zona fasciculata, and the zona reticularis. The zona glomerulosa secretes a classification of hormone called mineralocorticoids. All right, mineralocorticoids. And these guys are basically regulating electrolyte balance within the body. The zona fasciculata is secreting glucocorticoids, such as cortisol, which, as we know, is a stress hormone. And so what we see happening within these glucocorticoids is we are regulating the uptake and metabolism of glucose and or other carbohydrates. And then we have the zona reticularis, which is secreting androgens, things like testosterone. So this is the area of the adrenal cortex where females would actually be producing and releasing testosterone, much, much lower levels than the males. But also derivatives of testosterone, things like dihydroepialdosterone, or DHEA. Right? Dihydroepialdosterone is how that is pronounced. And other derivatives as well. Large quantities of the DHEA are actually secreted during fetal development within the male fetus, and then it is DHEA, which is actually converted into estrogen within the brain, and it's the accumulation of estrogen created from this DHEA that will drive the development of and the sexualization of regions of the brain. This here is a side-by-side. There is a typo on this image. There has been a typo on this image for many years. This is not the renal capsule. This is the adrenal capsule. And so I apologize for that typo. But here you can actually see the layers of the adrenal cortex as well as the medulla. And so you got a side-by-side comparison of the histology to an image. And so you can see where the zona glomerulosa is, the zona fasciculata, and the zona reticularis. And here is another view as well. This would be on scanning power. And so the last thing that we need to kind of spend a few minutes looking at is the pancreas. And we know that the pancreas has two main functions. It's got an exocrine function. That is what is secreting all of the pancreatic enzymes for digestion. And it has a endocrine function. And the endocrine function is the region of the pancreas that is known as the pancreatic islet or the islet of Langerhans. And there are four main cell types that you already are aware of that are contained within the pancreatic islets. The alpha cells, the beta cells, the delta cells, and the F cells. F cells, again, secrete the pancreatic polypeptides. And the job of the pancreatic polypeptides is to inhibit somatostatin. And so you are inhibiting somatostatin, which is secreted by the delta cells. Remember that somatostatin inhibits the beta cells and the alpha cells. And so it's inhibiting the release of insulin and glucagon. All right. I will say that insulin is also regulated not only by somatostatin, but insulin is also regulated by human growth hormone and adrenocorticotropic hormone as well. And that's basically a stimulatory regulation. So human growth hormone and adrenocorticotropic hormone stimulates the release of insulin to go ahead and help lower blood glucose levels. And so it is the human growth hormone and the adrenocorticotropic hormone that kind of counter the effects of somatostatin. Acetylcholine, as a neurotransmitter, can also go ahead and stimulate the release of insulin to go ahead and lead to the breakdown of glucose. And again, this here is just a diagram of the various cell types that we see associated with in the pancreatic islet. You can see again, it's just a magnified view of the pancreatic islet, which of course is right over here. And that is where we end our look at the endocrine system. Again, a lot of this was probably a review, but I did want to spend some time looking at especially the adrenal gland and the pituitary gland, because there is some additional information there for you as far as how in the world did these things get to have these very differing regions and areas and functions and regulatory responsibilities. And so hopefully that sheds some light on that for you. And so I encourage you to go through, review these videos, watch them a couple more times, make sure your notes are complete. If you have any questions, you know how to get a hold of me, and I will see you on the flip side.